It wasn't supposed to end this way. The sky split open, 1,000 needles of rain hammering the windshield as Neil Williams tightened his grip on the steering wheel. Ahead, the highway twisted in a blur of wet black and blinding white headlights. Fiona laughed beside him, warm and bright, her hand brushing his. Tomorrow, they were supposed to stand before everyone they loved and promise forever. Tomorrow, they were supposed to start the life they'd dreamed about since they were kids running wild through the London streets. Tomorrow. Neil glanced over at her, memorizing the curve of her smile, the way her golden hair clung to her cheeks in the humidity. The future stretched out before him, blinding, brilliant, beautiful. He never saw the truck. It roared out of the darkness like a monster unleashed, horn blaring, tires screaming across the slick pavement. Neil jerked the wheel hard left. The world exploded. Metal screamed. Glass shattered like thunder. Fiona's scream was the last thing he heard before everything spun into nothingness. Pain dragged him back, slow and cruel. The scent of gasoline. The sharp, metallic taste of blood in his mouth. The rain still pounding, the cold slicing into his skin. Neil tried to move, but agony ripped through his body, anchoring him to the crumpled wreckage. Fiona. His voice was a rasp, barely a whisper. He turned his head, a movement that felt like it might kill him. Fiona lay slumped against the door, her face obscured by a curtain of hair. Motionless. No. 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 Adrenaline surged, overriding pain. He stretched out a shaking hand, fingertips brushing her shoulder. "Fi," he choked. "Fi, wake up. Please." She didn't move. The darkness swallowed him again. Somewhere far away, sirens screamed. Somewhere, men in uniforms shouted. Hands pulled at him, strapped him to boards, lifted him into a blinding white void. He fought them. He screamed her name until his throat tore open and the world bled away. Tomorrow was supposed to be the happiest day of their lives. Instead, tomorrow would never come. It was too bright. The light pierced through Neil's eyelids, slicing into his brain like a hot blade. He flinched, tried to move, and pain exploded through his body like firecrackers in a closed room. A strangled gasp tore from his throat. Somewhere above him, machines beeped steadily, cold and mechanical. The air smelled like antiseptic and wet cloth. His mouth was dry, as if it had been filled with sand. Panic clawed at him. Where was he? Where was Fiona? Neil forced his eyes open, blinking against the painful white light overhead. The ceiling swam into focus first, then the pale green walls, the sterile environment of a hospital room. His heart raced, thudding unevenly against his ribs. He was alive. But Fiona. Neil turned his head slightly, biting down on a cry as his neck screamed in protest. The movement was slow, disjointed, as if his body no longer obeyed him. The room was empty. No golden hair shining in the light. No soft laughter filling the cold air. Fiona wasn't there. He tried to sit up, but agony slammed him back into the bed. His arms trembled violently against the restraints wrapped around his torso, holding him still. A cast enclosed one leg from thigh to foot. His right arm was bandaged heavily, his left pinned under wires and tubes. A low, broken sound escaped his lips. It barely sounded human. "Fi." The door swung open. A nurse entered, a woman with soft brown eyes and skin the color of rich earth. She wore a pale blue uniform, her braids tucked neatly under a white cap. She froze when she saw him awake, her eyes widening in shock and relief. "Mr. Williams, you're awake," she gasped, rushing to the monitors. Her voice was kind but trembling, as if she didn't know whether to be relieved or afraid. Neil opened his mouth to speak, but only a dry croak emerged. The nurse leaned close, her hands busy adjusting a drip. "Please, don't try to move yet. You're safe." You're in St. Luke's Medical Center. You've been unconscious for 3 days. 3 days. 3 days lost to the void. He gritted his teeth. He needed answers. He needed Fiona. He grabbed weakly at the nurse's wrist, his fingers barely able to close. Fiona, he rasped. Where is she? The nurse's face crumpled, and for a moment she looked away, her eyes shimmering with tears she struggled to hide. Silence. No. 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 Neil's vision blurred. The monitors around him spiked into frenzied beeps as his heart rate soared. He thrashed against the restraints, a wild, broken animal. Please, the nurse cried, hitting the emergency call button. Doctor. Doctor, hurry. The door burst open and a team rushed in, white coats, hands on his shoulders, needles plunged into lines, voices soothing but distant. Mr. Williams, calm down. You're safe now. Easy, easy. But there was no safe anymore. Not without her. The last thing Neil saw before the darkness dragged him under again was the nurse's face, a face full of sorrow, pity, and something even worse. Helplessness. Suzanne Hayes tucked a loose braid behind her ear and pressed the clipboard closer to her chest. Her palms were damp with nervousness as she stood in front of the heavy oak doors leading to the Williams estate's private study. She took a slow, steadying breath. This was it. The opportunity she had prayed for. The job offer that could finally help her save enough to open the small community clinic she'd dreamed about, the dream she and her late father had whispered about during long nights after her mother's passing. Now here she was, in the mansion of the richest family she had ever encountered, about to accept a job that would demand not just her skills as a nurse, but her heart. The door opened with a soft creak. Miss Hayes, a deep voice called. She stepped inside, her heels sinking slightly into the plush carpet. The study was massive, its high ceilings lined with heavy bookshelves and gold-framed portraits. In front of a sprawling mahogany desk sat Mr. Richard Williams, Neil's father, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a commanding presence and weary eyes. Beside him stood a woman, Mrs. Martha Williams, elegant, her dark skin glowing against a simple pearl necklace, but with a grief that no wealth could disguise. Thank you for coming, Mr. Williams said, rising to shake her hand. His grip was firm but brief. Please, sit. Suzanne lowered herself into the leather chair, clutching the clipboard to her lap like armor. You took care of Neil at St. Luke's, Mrs. Williams said gently, her voice carrying the same careful fragility of someone balancing on the edge of heartbreak. We've spoken to the doctors. They said he trusted you, even unconscious. That you were kind. Suzanne swallowed hard, memories of Neil's broken body flashing through her mind, the machines keeping him alive, the rare moments he stirred against the darkness. I did my best, she said softly. He's strong. Stronger than he knows, Mr. Williams muttered, almost to himself. A heavy silence filled the room, thick with things unspoken. Suzanne waited, her heart pounding. Finally, Mrs. Williams leaned forward. We want to hire you, Miss Hayes. Full-time. To move into the estate and care for Neil personally during his rehabilitation. He refuses anyone else. Suzanne's breath caught. Move in. Live here, among marble halls and chandeliers, tending to a man who had lost almost everything. It was more than a job. It was a commitment. I understand, she said, her voice steady. I'll do whatever it takes to help him heal. Mr. Williams nodded sharply, as if sealing a silent contract between them. You'll have full access to everything you need. Physical therapy rooms. Private medical staff. But, you must be patient with him, Miss Hayes. He's not just broken in body. His heart. He faltered, clearing his throat roughly. His heart is shattered. Suzanne's chest tightened. She knew what that kind of grief felt like. She lived with it every day. "I'll be patient," she promised. Mrs. Williams smiled then, a tremulous, hopeful smile. "Thank you." As Suzanne stood to leave, Mr. Williams added, almost as an afterthought, "He doesn't know you're coming yet. We'll introduce you carefully. When the time is right." Suzanne nodded, her mind already whirring with plans, schedules, therapy exercises, medications, and the delicate, careful work of coaxing a wounded soul back to life. She stepped out into the afternoon sun, feeling its warmth wash over her. Somewhere inside this house, a man named Neil Williams was fighting through a storm of grief. And somehow, she knew, without understanding how, that her own healing was tied to his. Maybe, just maybe, they would find their second chances together. The grand hallways of the Williams estate were eerily silent. Suzanne walked slowly behind Mrs. Williams, her shoes soundless against the polished marble floors. Every portrait they passed seemed to watch her, grandfathers, matriarchs, generations of success built on iron will and ruthless ambition. Yet no legacy could protect a family from grief. At the end of the corridor, Mrs. Williams paused beside a heavy door. She turned, her eyes filled with gentle warning. "He's not the man you might remember from the hospital," she said softly. "Please be patient with him, Suzanne. He's still fighting demons we can't see." Suzanne nodded once, clutching the strap of her leather satchel tight against her side. Mrs. Williams knocked lightly, then opened the door. The room inside was dimly lit, curtains half drawn against the brilliant afternoon sun. The scent of fresh linen and faint antiseptic filled the air. In the middle of it all sat Neil Williams, propped in a wide medical chair by the window, his frame wrapped in a dark blanket. Suzanne's heart squeezed at the sight of him. Gone was the powerful CEO she had glimpsed once in a newspaper article, shaking hands with foreign dignitaries, smiling confidently at global summits. This Neil was thinner, paler. A shadow of the man he used to be. His head was bowed, his dark curls falling over his forehead, hiding his expression. One leg was strapped carefully to a support brace, a wheelchair tucked against the side of the room like an unwanted reminder. At the soft click of the door, he didn't look up. Mrs. Williams cleared her throat gently. "Neil, darling. This is Suzanne Hayes. She'll be helping with your therapy from now on." Silence. A tense, brittle silence that stretched out like a cracked window pane, ready to shatter. Suzanne stepped forward, forcing a smile onto her lips. "Good afternoon, Mr. Williams," she said, her voice warm but respectful. "It's an honor to meet you properly." Still nothing. His hands tightened slightly over the blanket, so subtle that only someone watching closely would have noticed. Mrs. Williams touched Suzanne's elbow lightly. "I'll leave you two to get acquainted," she whispered, and disappeared out the door, pulling it closed behind her. Suzanne turned back to Neil. For a long moment, she simply stood there, studying him, letting him sense her presence without pressure. She knew better than to rush a patient fresh out of trauma. She knew that silence, when honored, could sometimes speak louder than 1,000 words. Finally, Neil moved. Slowly, painfully, he raised his head, and Suzanne found herself staring into a pair of eyes so dark, so hollowed by pain, that it was like looking straight into a broken soul. There was anger there. But underneath it, a bone-deep sorrow that hit her like a physical blow. "I don't need a babysitter," Neil said flatly, his voice rough from disuse. Suzanne swallowed down her instinct to react defensively. "I'm not here to babysit you," she said gently. "I'm here to help you walk again." A bitter laugh escaped him, a hollow, humorless sound that echoed in the vast room. "Don't waste your time," he muttered, turning his face back toward the window. Suzanne hesitated only a moment, then moved closer, pulling up a small chair a few feet away. She didn't speak again. Didn't push. She simply sat with him. And for the first time in a long time, Neil Williams wasn't alone with his pain. The morning sun filtered through heavy curtains, casting long slashes of light across the quiet room. Suzanne set down a tray of medical supplies and therapy tools on the side table, her heart pounding a steady, nervous beat. Neil sat by the window again, a statue carved from grief and stubbornness. He hadn't spoken a word to her since their brief, painful meeting the day before. Today would be harder. Today, she would ask him to move. She approached slowly, announcing her presence with soft footsteps. "Good morning, Mr. Williams," she said, keeping her voice light but respectful. No response. Only the subtle tightening of his jaw. Suzanne knelt beside his chair, laying out the therapy bands and lightweight dumbbells. "I know you don't feel ready," she said quietly, "but even small movements will help your muscles remember." Still silence. Suzanne studied him carefully. The deep set of his shoulders. The angry clench of his fingers around the blanket. The storm raging behind his eyes, barely hidden. 5 minutes, she bargained gently. "That's all I'm asking." At last, he moved, just his head, turning slightly to glare at her. There was bitterness in that look. And a deep, exhausted sorrow. "Why do you even care?" he rasped. The question caught her off guard. It wasn't defiance. It was genuine confusion. Suzanne swallowed hard, steadying herself. "Because I know what it feels like," she said softly. "To lose everything. To wonder if you'll ever stand up again." For the first time, Neil blinked, and the hardness in his gaze wavered, just a crack. Silently, he shifted his hands free of the blanket. Suzanne bit back a surge of emotion and quickly adjusted the wheelchair locks, gently supporting his left wrist. "Easy," she murmured. "Just lift your arm if you can. We'll start small." His muscles trembled with the effort. Sweat beaded on his brow. His breathing grew ragged. But he did it. 1 inch. 2 inches. It wasn't much. It wasn't heroic. But it was a beginning. Suzanne smiled, not a patronizing smile, but a fierce, proud one. "Good," she whispered. "That's good, Mr. Williams." Neil let out a shaky breath and sagged back against the chair, exhausted. Suzanne didn't push further. She simply handed him a cool cloth and let him have his silence, his victory. Across the room, the morning sun edged a little higher, spilling more light into the darkness. And maybe, just maybe, today, a tiny step forward had been taken. Neil gripped the edge of the therapy table so hard his knuckles turned white. Again, Suzanne said softly. He wanted to snap at her. Tell her to leave him the hell alone. Tell her he wasn't some project to be pieced back together like broken glass. But instead, he ground his teeth and tried again. His hand shook violently as he reached for the small, bright yellow ball she had placed just inches away. His fingers barely brushed it before spasming with pain. The ball rolled off the table. Neil cursed under his breath, closing his eyes tightly against the surge of shame. He could once command entire boardrooms. Negotiate multi-million-dollar deals across 3 continents without breaking a sweat. And now? Now he couldn't even hold a rubber ball. Suzanne knelt silently, picked it up, and placed it back in front of him. No judgment. No pity. Just patience. Neil opened his mouth, about to tell her she was wasting her time, that he would never be the man he was, but when he glanced at her, he stopped. She wasn't looking at him with disappointment. Or condescension. She was looking at him like he mattered. Even like this. Broken. Defeated. Maybe especially like this. It terrified him more than anything else had since the accident. The session ended without either of them saying much more. Suzanne simply packed up the therapy tools with quiet efficiency, logging notes on a small tablet. Neil stared out the window, the burning sun too bright for his mood. Somewhere out there, life continued. Cars honked. Children laughed. People kissed their loved ones goodbye and raced toward their dreams. For him, time had stopped. He had died on that road beside Fiona. This broken body was just a cruel afterthought. As Suzanne moved to leave, she paused at the door. "You fought hard today," she said gently, her voice slicing through the thick silence. Neil said nothing. Didn't even turn his head. But as the door clicked softly shut behind her, he let out a shaky breath. Somewhere deep inside the ruins of himself, a tiny ember sparked, stubborn, defiant. He wasn't ready to admit it yet. But he had fought. And maybe, just maybe, he could fight again tomorrow. The rain returned that night, soft and steady against the tall windows of the Williams estate. It was the kind of rain that whispered of old memories, of moments lost and promises broken. Neil lay restless in his bed, the sheets tangled around his weakened legs. The painkillers dulled the ache in his body but did nothing for the storm raging in his mind. Sleep came for him like a thief, dragging him back, back, to the day before everything shattered. They were laughing. He could see it, clear as if it were happening again. Fiona's hand in his. The London sky above them, painted in watercolor blues and golds. The way she tipped her head back when she laughed, carefree, fearless, beautiful. They raced down the old stone steps near the university quad, dodging tourists and street vendors, hearts pounding from too much coffee and too much life. "I can't believe you're really going to marry me," she teased, bumping his shoulder. Neil grinned, pulling her closer. "You make it sound like you conned me into it." "I did," Fiona laughed, her eyes sparkling. "You just never stood a chance." He kissed her then, right there on the crowded street, not caring who saw. The world had been perfect. Untouchable. Theirs. A crash of thunder ripped across the night sky. Neil jerked awake, heart hammering. But the dream clung to him like smoke. Fiona's laughter echoed in his ears, cruel now in its absence. A strangled sound escaped his throat, half sob, half broken plea. His fists twisted the sheets, pulling them tight against his chest. Across the room, unseen in the shadows, Suzanne paused. She had come to check his vitals, as she did every night. Quietly, respectfully. But now she stood frozen, her hand against her mouth, heartbreaking for him. She wanted to go to him. To tell him he wasn't alone. That someone cared, even if it could never replace what he had lost. But she didn't move. She understood grief too well to intrude on it. Instead, she stood silently in the dark, letting him mourn, letting him remember, letting him fight through the agony on his own terms. Because sometimes, healing didn't start with words. It started with knowing someone was simply there. Neil's breathing slowly evened out. The storm inside him settled into a low, aching throb. And from the shadows, Suzanne whispered in her heart the words she knew he wasn't ready to hear aloud. "You are not alone." The day was thick with humidity, the air heavy with the smell of rain that refused to fall. Suzanne sat quietly across from Neil, a stack of therapy tools resting untouched on the small table between them. Today was supposed to be a light session, simple hand stretches, maybe some light resistance training. But Neil hadn't moved. He sat in his wheelchair by the open window, his face unreadable, his dark eyes focused far beyond the sprawling estate gardens outside. Suzanne didn't push him. She had learned, in these few weeks, that sometimes silence was better than force. She simply waited. Finally, without looking at her, Neil spoke. "You don't have to keep sitting there, you know," he muttered. His voice was low, rough, the sound of a man who had spent too many nights battling himself. "I know," Suzanne said calmly. "I'm not here because I have to be." Neil's fingers flexed slightly over the armrest. Minutes ticked by. The faint chirping of distant birds filled the space between them. Then, almost too softly to catch, Neil asked, "Why?" Suzanne blinked. Not because she didn't have an answer, but because she hadn't expected the question to come from him. She leaned forward, her voice low but steady. "Because I believe you're still in there," she said. "The man you were before, he's still fighting. Maybe he's buried deep, but he's not gone." Neil's jaw tightened. For a moment, she thought he would turn away again, shut her out completely. But instead, he did something she hadn't seen in all these weeks. He nodded. Barely. Almost imperceptibly. But it was there, a tiny, reluctant agreement. Something inside Suzanne's chest ached at the sight. They worked slowly after that. Simple stretches, nothing aggressive. Suzanne guided his hand gently, careful not to push, careful not to demand. At first, Neil barely tolerated the contact. But as the minutes passed, the tension in his muscles eased. And when he managed to lift the light resistance band 2 full inches without trembling, Suzanne smiled, not a professional, clinical smile, but a real one, warm and proud. "You're stronger than you think," she said softly. Neil didn't respond. But when he lowered the band back to the table, his gaze met hers briefly. And for the first time since the accident, Neil Williams didn't look through her. He looked at her. Small. Fragile. Barely a whisper of progress. But in the world of healing hearts, even a whisper could be the beginning of something extraordinary. The therapy room smelled faintly of fresh paint and lemon polish. It had been remodeled just for him, a small gym tucked away on the east side of the Williams estate, filled with bright windows, soft mats, parallel bars, and enough equipment to rebuild a broken man. Neil hated it. He hated the pity in the eyes of the contractors who had installed the bars. He hated the quiet sympathy in the glances of passing staff. He hated how weak he felt just being here. But most of all, he hated how much hope Suzanne still had for him. Today, she stood by the parallel bars, her braided hair pulled back, her light blue scrubs freshly pressed. She adjusted the bars carefully, glancing at him now and then, but never hurrying him. She understood that battles like this were fought first in the mind. Neil sat in his wheelchair, fists clenched so hard the veins in his arms bulged. He stared at the bars like they were enemies. Daring him. Mocking him. "You don't have to do this today," Suzanne said gently. "You can try tomorrow. Or the next day." Neil gritted his teeth. Tomorrow. Tomorrow. Everything in his life had been about tomorrow for too long. No. Not today. Today, he would fight. Slowly, painfully, Neil shifted forward, planting his good foot against the mat. His injured legs shook under the strain, but he forced himself upright, bracing heavily against the chair's arms. Suzanne moved to his side but didn't touch him unless he asked. The unspoken trust between them had become a language all its own. Neil gripped the cold metal bar. His arms shook. Sweat poured down his forehead. But he was standing. Not well. Not tall. Not without pain. But standing. Suzanne's hand hovered near his back, ready to catch him, but she didn't say a word. This was his victory to claim. Neil took one ragged, trembling breath. And shifted his weight forward. His foot slid forward a few inches along the bar. Then another. Pain screamed. Through him. Old wounds tore open inside his mind. Images of Fiona flashed behind his eyes, her smile, her laugh, the blood on the road, the lifeless stillness. Neil squeezed his eyes shut. Breathed through it. And moved forward again. By the time he collapsed back into the wheelchair, every muscle in his body screamed for mercy. His hands trembled violently. His chest heaved. But Suzanne knelt in front of him, tears bright in her eyes, smiling that fierce, proud smile she reserved only for him. "You did it," she whispered. Neil stared at her, disbelieving. "I." His voice cracked. He didn't need to finish the sentence. Today, he hadn't been just a broken man. Today, he had fought. Today, he had won. Maybe tomorrow still held pain. Maybe tomorrow would be harder. But today, he had taken the first step toward it. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Neil Williams believed in tomorrow again. The therapy room had fallen into a golden hush as the sun sank lower outside the windows. Suzanne stood by the wall, quietly logging notes on her tablet. Neil sat slumped in his wheelchair, a towel draped around his neck, still breathing heavily from the effort it had taken to stand. The room smelled of sweat, lemon polish, and something warmer. Hope. Suzanne finished her notes and looked up, and found Neil watching her. Really watching her. Not with the empty, distant look he used to wear. Not with the helpless anger. But with something closer to curiosity. Recognition. Something fragile, and dangerous, and new. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Suzanne set the tablet down gently, smoothing her hands over her scrub pants. "You did really well today," she said, her voice softer than usual. Neil didn't answer right away. He was still watching her, his dark eyes intense and unreadable. Finally, he said, "You don't give up on people easily, do you?" Suzanne smiled. Small, real, a little sad. "Maybe because I know what it feels like when everyone else does," she said. There was a long, aching pause. Neil's fingers drummed lightly on the wheelchair's armrest. He seemed to want to say something, to ask something, but the words got trapped somewhere in his throat. Instead, he asked, "Will you stay for a while?" Suzanne blinked, surprised. "Just sit?" Neil added, awkward, like he hated how vulnerable he sounded. She pulled a chair closer without hesitation. They sat in silence for a while, side by side. The only sound was the soft rustling of the trees outside and the faint rhythmic beeping of distant medical monitors. It should have been awkward. It wasn't. It was peaceful. Natural. Right. At one point, Suzanne shifted slightly, brushing her hand against Neil's. The contact was light, accidental, but electric. Neil's breath caught. He didn't pull away. Neither did she. For a heartbeat, the air between them changed. At one point, Suzanne shifted slightly, brushing her hand against Neil's. The contact was light, accidental, but electric. Neil's breath caught. He didn't pull away. Neither did she. For a heartbeat, the air between them changed, thickened, spun something invisible and delicate between their bodies. And when Suzanne finally stood to leave, Neil's hand hovered in the air for half a second, as if he almost reached for her. Almost. But not yet. Small steps. Small victories. The same way broken hearts learn to beat again, Neil hated the way he noticed her now. The small things. The way Suzanne tucked a stray braid behind her ear when she concentrated. The way her eyes softened when she watched him struggle, not with pity, but with pride. The quiet strength she carried in her every step. It terrified him. He wasn't supposed to feel this way. Not now. Not ever again. His heart belonged to Fiona, or it had, once. Was it betrayal to feel the way he did when Suzanne smiled? To crave her nearness? To find comfort in her voice? Neil tightened his grip on the wheelchair's arms, his body tense as Suzanne adjusted a strap on his therapy brace. She worked carefully, her hands gentle, her head bowed just enough for him to study the curve of her jaw, the fullness of her lips. Desire twisted inside him, fierce and sudden. It knocked the air from his lungs. He looked away sharply, guilt slamming into him like a punch. Fiona's laugh echoed in his mind, warm and golden. Her voice, teasing. "You're stuck with me, Williams. Forever." Neil closed his eyes. Forever. But Fiona was gone. And Suzanne was here. Real. Alive. He heard her sigh softly as she straightened, misunderstanding his sudden stiffness. You're doing well, she said gently, giving him space. He hated that he hurt her even without meaning to. Thanks, he muttered, keeping his eyes averted. The rest of the session passed in stiff, awkward silence. Suzanne didn't push. Didn't ask questions. She simply helped him through the exercises and then packed away the therapy bands, moving quieter than usual, like someone tiptoeing around a wounded animal. Neil hated himself for missing her touch the moment it was gone. Later, alone in his room, Neil stared out into the blackness beyond the window. The rain had returned, painting the glass in slow, steady rivers. He touched his chest lightly, where the ache had started. Not the ache of injury. Something deeper. Something more dangerous. He was falling for her. And it scared him more than dying ever had. The storm had rolled in fast that evening. Thunder rumbled low over the hills beyond the Williams estate, shaking the windows in their frames. Rain lashed the glass in frantic, desperate waves. Neil sat by the fireplace in the study, a blanket draped loosely over his shoulders. He stared into the flames, lost in thought, lost in battles he could no longer fight alone. Across the room, Suzanne lingered near the doorway. She hesitated, something she rarely did. Usually, she moved with purpose, with quiet certainty. But tonight, she waited. Waited for him. Waited for something neither of them could name. You can come closer, Neil said hoarsely, without looking up. Suzanne stepped into the warm light of the fire, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The room was thick with unsaid things. Neil shifted in his chair, facing her fully. The crackle of the fire filled the heavy silence between them. I've been cruel to you, he said finally, his voice low, rough with emotion. Pushing you away. Pretending you were just a nurse. Just someone passing through. Suzanne opened her mouth, but he held up a hand, stopping her. I thought it was loyalty, he continued. To Fiona. To what we had. I thought if I moved on, even an inch, it would mean I'd forgotten her. Betrayed her. He looked up at her then, really looked, and Suzanne saw the storm raging behind his dark eyes. But it's not betrayal, Neil whispered. It's survival. Suzanne's breath caught. You saved my life, Suzanne, he said fiercely. Not just my body. My soul. Piece by broken piece. The firelight flickered across his face, highlighting every raw emotion, grief, fear, hope. I tried to fight it, he said. God knows, I tried. He wheeled himself a little closer, his hand reaching toward her. But I can't anymore. Suzanne's heart thundered in her chest as she stepped into his reach. Neil's hand found hers, strong, trembling, desperate, and their fingers tangled together like vines seeking the sun. I don't know how to do this, he said. I don't know how to be whole again. But if I have a chance, even a broken one, I want it with you. Tears welled in Suzanne's eyes, blurring the world into gold and shadow. You're not broken, Neil, she whispered. You're alive. And you're loved. At those words, simple, powerful, undeniable, Neil closed his eyes. And when he opened them again, it was as if a great weight had fallen away. He pulled her closer, and she went willingly, sinking onto the edge of his chair, their foreheads touching, their breath mingling. Outside, the storm howled. Inside, two broken hearts found a new beat, together. The morning was still and golden. Sunlight spilled through the wide windows of the Williams estate, painting the marble floors with soft, dappled patterns. Outside, the gardens bloomed again, bright, alive, full of second chances. Neil sat in his wheelchair near the edge of the terrace, a light breeze tugging gently at the loose shirt he wore. His cast was gone now. The therapy sessions had grown stronger. His body was healing. His soul was learning how to breathe again. Behind him, light footsteps approached. He didn't have to look to know it was her. Suzanne. The woman who had refused to give up on him. The woman who had stitched together the torn pieces of his broken life with nothing but patience, kindness, and a strength more powerful than any storm. Neil turned his head slightly as she came into view. Suzanne wore a simple white sundress today, her braids tied back loosely, her smile easy and real. She carried 2 mugs of coffee, the steam curling in the cool morning air. "You're up early," she teased, handing him a cup. "Trying to catch up to you," Neil said, his voice lighter than it had been in months. Suzanne laughed softly and sat down beside him on a wicker chair. They drank their coffee in silence, the peace between them deep and natural. No need for rushed words. No need to fill the spaces. They simply were. After a while, Neil set his cup aside and shifted, moving from the chair to the parallel bars they had set up on the terrace for his morning exercises. Suzanne rose instinctively to steady him but paused when he lifted a hand, signaling he wanted to try alone. He gripped the bars, testing his weight, feeling the tremble in his muscles. His heart pounded. The old fear whispered at the back of his mind, "You'll fall. You'll fail." But another voice, stronger, fiercer, rooted in hope, whispered louder. "You're not alone anymore." With a deep breath, Neil took a step forward. Unsteady. Shaking. But he moved. Suzanne clapped her hands over her mouth, tears springing to her eyes. Another step. Another. Until he reached the end of the bars. Neil turned, breathing hard, pride and disbelief crashing over him. Suzanne rushed forward then, unable to hold back, flinging her arms around him in a tight, trembling hug. "You did it," she whispered into his shoulder. "We did it," Neil corrected, holding her as tightly as he dared. They pulled back slightly, faces inches apart. And then, slowly, carefully, Neil lowered his forehead against hers, just as he had that night by the fire. Their eyes closed. The world faded. And when Neil tilted his head and pecked her, soft, tentative, full of wonder, Suzanne pecked him back without hesitation. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. But it was real. And sometimes, that was better than perfect. Together, they stood on the edge of a new tomorrow. A future born from pain, yes, but also from love. From healing. From second chances. And this time, they would take every step forward together.